April 28th, 2011. High on an icy ridge in the Alps, Swiss climber Erhard Loretan moved with the calm focus of a man who had spent his entire life defying gravity, storms, and death in the mountains. But today, on his 52nd birthday, it would be his last climb. From conquering the tallest mountain in the world without oxygen to becoming hated and judged, this is the story of a mountaineering legend who survived Everest only to die on a hill in his backyard. Welcome to the Extreme Edge. Erhard Loretan was born on April 28, 1959, in the quiet Swiss town of Buhl, surrounded by the towering silhouettes of the Alps. For many people, mountains are weekend escapes or vacation scenery. For Erhard, they were the air he breathed. His childhood wasn't spent in front of screens or wandering paved streets. It was spent chasing shadows on ridgelines, climbing boulders without ropes, and feeling the icy wind sting his cheeks as he explored trails far above the valley floor. Much of this early obsession came from his cousin Fritz, the guardian of the Frunden hut in the Bernese Alps. Every summer, Erhard stayed with him, and every summer, the mountains tightened their grip on the boy. Fritz led him over winding ridges and rocky paths. Erhard watched the older climbers who visited the hut. He studied their gear, their calm confidence, the reverence they held for the mountains. Without knowing it, he was being shaped, mentored, molded into someone who would one day join their ranks. At 11, Erhard climbed his first mountain, Dent de Brock. At 15, he scaled the steep east face of the Doldenhorn, nearly 12,000 feet tall. When he stood on that summit, breathless and trembling, something clicked inside him. The world spread out beneath his feet, quiet and endless. That sense of freedom, that feeling of being suspended between earth and sky, became the fuel of his life. But the mountains demand more than passion. They demand sacrifice. And as Erhard's life unfolded, he would give them everything. Tiny detour on this chaos train. Every week on Patreon, I share something deeper, an exclusive video, a breakdown of what really happened, or a personal story I don't put on YouTube. If you want to go behind the scenes with me, come join the Extreme community on Patreon. See you there. As Erhard moved from his teenage years into adulthood, his relationship with the mountains transformed from simple fascination into something far more serious, almost spiritual. He didn't climb for fame or recognition. He climbed because it was the only place where his mind felt clear, where the world made sense, where effort, precision, and respect were the only currencies that mattered. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Himalayan climbing was dominated by what many called siege tactics, massive expeditions carrying tons of gear, teams of Sherpas fixing ropes across entire faces, climbers establishing a ladder of high camps, slowly inching their way upward with oxygen tanks strapped to their backs. It was how the big peaks were conquered, but to Erhard, it felt artificial. It felt like cheating. He wanted purity. He wanted simplicity. He wanted to face the mountain as it was, not with an army behind him, but as a single human being with nothing but skill, instinct, and courage. This philosophy placed him among the pioneers of alpine-style climbing. No fixed ropes, no bottled oxygen, no massive support teams, just 2 or 3 climbers moving fast and light, accepting the full consequences of their choices. Every step was risk. Every decision was irreversible. It was a style that killed many, but it drew Erhard in like a magnet. His first major expedition came in 1982, when he stood at the base of Nanga Parbat, a 26,000-foot monster known as the Killer Mountain. The Daimir face towered over him, a brutal mix of loose rock, collapsing seracs, and avalanche zones that could erase a climber in seconds. Even then, Erhard moved with purpose, with control, with the calm of someone who had already made peace with the danger. He reached the summit after months of brutal climbing, but when he looked out from the top of the mountain, instead of pride, he felt disappointment. He had used fixed ropes during the ascent, and in his mind, that meant he hadn't climbed the mountain the way he believed it should be climbed. From that day on, he vowed never to use them again. Over the next decade, Erhard's career exploded into a series of legendary ascents. Annapurna, Makalu, K2, Cho Oyu. One by one, he climbed the world's deadliest peaks in pure alpine style. He didn't set out to complete all 14 8,000-meter giants, but slowly, inevitably, he found himself crossing them off. Climbers train for years to reach Everest. They join massive expeditions, they haul oxygen tanks, they rely on teams of Sherpas to pave the way. Erhard chose the opposite. He and Swiss-Canadian climber Jean Trier would ascend the north face of Everest the hard way. No oxygen, no fixed ropes, no camps waiting with warm food, no guides to help them if things fell apart. It was a strategy so bold that many climbers privately believed it would kill him. On August 30th, 1986, they left their advanced base camp on the Rongbuk Glacier and began their ascent. The North Face is notorious. Jagged ice, knife-edge ridges, winds that can knock you off your feet, a place where mistakes are permanent. But Erhard climbed as if he had been born in thin air. He and Jean moved with shocking speed, pushing through the death zone with minimal gear. Their lungs strained, their legs trembled, but neither slowed. In just 43 hours round trip, they completed one of the most astonishing ascents in mountaineering history. They slid down the slopes on their backs, carving a dangerous, blisteringly fast descent that shaved hours off their exposure time. When they reached base camp, the climbing world knew something had changed. Everest had been climbed in a way no one believed possible. But the mountains were not done with Erhard. Fresh off the impossible ascent of Everest, Erhard Loretan had become a ghost of the high peaks, a man who moved through the mountains with a speed and purity that felt almost unreal. Climbers spoke about him in hushed tones, like someone who had tapped into a deeper understanding of the mountains that the rest of them could only guess at. But even legends bleed. Only months after Everest, Erhard attempted a new route on Cho Oyu with his friend Pierre Allen Steiner. It should have been another bold adventure, another test of skill and endurance. Instead, it turned into one of the darkest moments of his life. A storm crashed into the mountain without warning, swallowing them in whiteout conditions. Wind howled like a living thing. Snow buried footprints seconds after they were made, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. They were forced to retreat, inching their way down the slope, every moment careful, every step a gamble. Then, Pierre slipped. He fell hundreds of meters down the mountain, bouncing off ice and rock. In the jagged silence that followed, Erhard scrambled after him, expecting the worst. Against all odds, Pierre was alive, broken, bleeding, but alive. The storm raged around them. The temperature plummeted. They were trapped. Erhard had one choice. He carved a small shelter, a desperate snow cave barely big enough to keep the wind away from Pierre, and then he set off for base camp. It was a brutal descent. He stumbled blindly, frost biting at his fingers. His legs shook with exhaustion. His body screamed for rest. But when he reached base camp, he found nothing. Everyone was gone. The Sherpas, the support team, the other climbers, all forced down the mountain by the same storm that had trapped Erhard and Pierre. They had assumed no one could have survived that high. For 3 days, Erhard fought his way back to Pierre. 3 days in the storm. 3 days climbing with almost no food, no sleep, and no guarantee he would find his friend alive. Astonishingly, Pierre was still breathing when he returned, but he was barely holding on. During the rescue attempt, Pierre died, and something inside Erhard cracked. No one blamed him. Climbers and rescuers told him he had done everything any human could have done, but logic does not heal guilt, and the guilt consumed him. For years, Erhard drifted into a fog of depression. He avoided the spotlight. He avoided high-risk peaks for a time. He questioned everything he had ever believed about the mountains, about risk, about the line between bravery and recklessness. But slowly, painfully, the mountains called him back. In 1989, he and André Georges launched an almost unthinkable challenge. They climbed 13 major north faces in the Bernese Oberland in 13 days. The Eiger, the Feicherhorn, the Schreckhorn, one after another, as if he were reclaiming a piece of himself with each ascent. A year later, he returned to Cho Oyu, the mountain that had taken his friend. It was an act of mourning, of honoring Pierre, and when he finally reached the summit, he let the wind carry his grief. By the mid-1990s, one final mountain stood between him and becoming the third person in history to climb all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, Kanchenjunga. By autumn of 1995, Erhard Loretan stood on the edge of mountaineering immortality. 13 of the world's 14 8,000-meter giants were already behind him. Each one climbed in pure alpine style. No oxygen, no fixed ropes, no armies of support climbers, just speed, precision, instinct, and the willingness to accept whatever the mountain demanded. Only Kanchenjunga remained, the third highest mountain on Earth and one of the most unpredictable. Known for its unstable weather and massive faces that collapse without warning, Kanchenjunga was a final exam unlike any other. A mountain that punished hesitation, punished pride, punished even the smallest lapse in judgment. But Erhard wasn't climbing for recognition. He wasn't climbing for a record. He was climbing because this was all he knew. This was what he was made for. On October 5th, 1995, he ascended through the thinning air near 28,000 feet, where the wind cuts like a blade and the cold sinks into your bones. The world narrows up there. Every breath burns. Every step feels like dragging your body through wet cement. The air is too thin to think straight, too thin to dream, too thin to live. Yet, Erhard kept climbing. By mid-afternoon, he reached the summit, the final one. 14 peaks above 8,000 meters, all climbed without supplemental oxygen. Only Reinhold Messner had achieved this before him, and to this day, barely any human beings alive can claim the same. Erhard had done what almost no one else in history had the strength, skill, or willpower to do, and in the years that followed, he became a quiet legend. Not a man seeking interviews or praise, he avoided fame, he avoided cameras. He preferred to let the mountains speak for him. But life has a way of offering triumph with one hand and tragedy with the other. 6 years after completing one of the greatest mountaineering achievements in history, Erhard Loretan faced something far more devastating than any avalanche, storm, or fall he had survived: the death of his infant son. It was late 2001 when tragedy struck. His baby had been crying through the night. Exhausted, overwhelmed, Erhard reached a breaking point. In a moment of frustration he later described as the worst mistake of his life, he shook the baby to quiet him. The crying stopped. He placed the child back into the crib, but the damage was already done. The next day, his son was dead. An autopsy revealed severe brain injuries, and Erhard was charged with negligent homicide. The courts recognized his remorse, the absence of intent, and the impossibly painful context. But that did nothing to change the fact that a child was gone. Many in the public turned against him. The hero of the Alps was suddenly a villain in the headlines. First loved, now universally hated. Overwhelmed by grief, guilt, and horror, Erhard made a decision no one really expected. He waived his right to anonymity. He wanted people to understand how fragile infants truly are. He wanted no other parent to make the same terrible mistake he did in one short moment. But none of that could bring his son back. In the years that followed, Erhard vanished from the public eye. He still climbed quietly and privately, but the fire that once burned inside him had dimmed. The mountains became therapy, a place to breathe, a place to exist without judgment. Almost a decade passed in silence. And then came the day that brought everything full circle. April 28th, 2011, his 52nd birthday. A day that should have been nothing more than a simple alpine outing with his partner Xenia. But for Erhard, the mountains had never been simple. Even on familiar slopes, even on peaks he had climbed dozens of times, the Alps always carried an undercurrent of danger, a quiet warning humming beneath the ice. That morning, the air was sharp and crystalline, the kind of cold that bites into every breath. The Bernese Alps stretched out in every direction, their ridges glowing under the rising sun. The Grünhorn, though far from the world's biggest peaks, was still a serious mountain. Its ridges were exposed, its snow conditions unpredictable. But compared to the 8,000ers, this felt like home. Xenia followed close behind Erhard as they made their way along the summit ridge. The world was silent, except for the soft crunch of crampons biting into snow and the faint whisper of wind weaving between the rocks. The slope was hard-packed and slick from recent snowfall. Beneath a thin crust of white, sheets of blue ice lurked, the kind of ice that gives no second chances. Erhard moved with the precision of a man who had lived his entire life on the edge of the impossible. His axe placements were steady, his breathing calm. Even here, even now, he carried the quiet discipline of a climber who had survived storms on K2, who had raced up Everest's north face without oxygen, who had watched others die, and somehow kept moving. Then came the slip. It didn't happen with drama or sound. It wasn't a spectacular fall. It was small, sudden, the kind of slip every climber has experienced. But timing is everything, and on a knife-edge ridge, even a tiny mistake can become catastrophic. Xenia's crampons skidded on a patch of buried ice. Her foot shot forward. She lost her balance. In a heartbeat, her body was sliding, picking up speed, the slope beneath her accelerating her descent. Erhard reacted instantly. Years of instinct surged through him. He drove his ice axe into the slope, anchoring himself, preparing to self-arrest the fall, but the rope between them snapped tight. When two climbers are roped together, the physics are brutal. The heavier climber can sometimes stop the fall of the lighter, but when the momentum is too strong, when the ice is too hard, when the angle is too steep, the rope stops being a lifeline. It becomes a lever. Xenia's fall yanked Erhard clean off his stance. His axe tore free. His boots lost traction. And suddenly, both of them were tumbling down the mountain. The world became a blur of white, blue, and shadow. Ice tore at their clothing. Rocks flashed past in streaks. The slope accelerated them like a slide angled toward oblivion. Witnesses would later say the fall stretched over 650 feet, long enough for terror, long enough for acceptance. When the tumbling finally stopped, the slope lay scattered with torn snow, gouges from ice axes, and debris from the fall. Xenia, battered and barely conscious, lay at an angle that should have been impossible to survive. But she did. Erhard did not. Rescuers arrived as fast as they could, navigating the dangerous terrain to reach the pair. But by the time they reached Erhard, he was gone. A climber who had survived some of the worst dangers on Earth had been taken by a mountain half the size of those he once dominated. Later, Xenia would share the memory that haunted her most. During the fall, as the world whipped past and the mountain rushed up to meet her, she had accepted she was about to die. She prayed only that it would not be painful. She never imagined that she would be the one to survive and that Erhard would be the one rescued too late. It was a painful reminder of something every mountaineer knows but rarely says aloud. You can survive the impossible for decades, but in the mountains, survival is never cumulative. You don't earn extra lives. You don't gain immunity from risk. No matter how skilled you are, no matter how many summits you've reached, the mountain doesn't care. All it takes is a moment. When the rescuers carried Erhard's body down the mountain, the climbing world fell silent. This was a man who had survived storms that ripped tents from ridgelines, a man who had outrun avalanches, outclimbed giants, and pushed through pain that would have broken almost anyone else. Yet, in the end, it was a quiet ridge in the Alps that stopped him. Not an 8,000-meter face, not a Himalayan monster, a simple slip on a mountain he trusted. And maybe that is the truth his life leaves behind. The mountains don't care about talent or records or how many times you've walked away from the edge. They don't keep score. They offer beauty and danger. And sometimes they take more than they give. Erhard Loretan was many things. A pioneer of alpine style, a climber who moved faster and lighter than almost any of his generation, a man who carried grief he never escaped, a legend who proved that at the end of the day, we're all just humans. He lived high, he climbed higher, and when the mountain finally called him home, he met it the only way he knew how. Quiet, focused, moving upward. Thanks for watching. Stay bold and live brave.